Good afternoon. Welcome to this webcast. Thank you for joining us for this writing series webcast, Framing the Writing Classroom Through Asset-Based Equitable Instruction, Culturally Sustaining Pedagogies Through Knowledge Transfer Frameworks. Hello, I'm Jennifer Wicks. We are coming to you live from System-Wide Professional Development, Learning and Development here at the Office of the Chancellor. Thank you for starting us off by filling out the polls on the screen. Let us know where you're joining from today and what your role in your department is on your campus. And also, how are you viewing this webcast? Looks like everyone's joining alone at their computer. I know we have kind of a very, just a smaller group today. It is May, and so we appreciate your attendance and for being here. So I'd like to just take a quick moment here and switch over to our Footprint Savings Pod. Actually, Footprints will collect the data behind the scenes and just capture the carbon emissions and the miles saved. So we'll let that capture behind the scenes today. We'll jump right into introducing the presenters involved in this session today. Of course, our host, Emily Magruder, our host for this series. She's the director of the Institute for Teaching and Learning here at the Office of the Chancellor. And our two guests today from Humboldt State University. Libby R. Miller serves as assistant professor in the Department of Education at Humboldt State. Her research interests include culturally sustaining pedagogy, participatory democratic education, and educational technology as a tool for student voice. She is currently developing a framework for implementing reflective practice in education as a social justice initiative. Her most recent work includes a forthcoming publication investigating the impact of tablet technology on faculty instructional practices at a regional public university. She has also authored several practitioner-oriented books for educators. Also joining us today is Lisa Tremain, the director of the first year composition program and assistant professor of writing practices, also at Humboldt State University. Her research considers writing knowledge development and transfer through ecological perspectives. She is currently examining the intersections between instructor development and uptake, writing program design and assessment, and student and faculty labor. She has most recently authored chapters in the collections Next Steps, New Directions for in Writing About Writing, 2019, and Reconsidering What We Know, Learning Thresholds in Writing, Composition, Rhetoric, and Literacy, which is forthcoming. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation now over to Emily Magruder to begin.
Thank you, Jennifer. On behalf of the CSU Institute for Teaching and Learning, I'd like to welcome you to today's webcast on framing the writing classroom through asset-based equitable instruction. This year, as the CSU has implemented new policies on placing students into first-year courses, we've had the opportunity to examine our processes for designing courses to promote learning, our processes for providing students with the level of academic support they need when they need it as they strengthen their identities as writers, and our processes for creating communities of practice for instructors to ensure high-quality teaching and learning across all sections of entry-level courses. In the fall, we had webcasts on building meaningful writing assessment, universal design for deep learning and composition, multilingual learners and heterogeneous writing classrooms, and enhancing academic literacy by linking reading and college writing. This spring, the series has taken a deeper dive into inclusive and equity-minded approaches to composition instruction. Today, we're delighted to have Lisa Tremain, Director of First Year Writing, and Libby Miller, Assistant Professor of Secondary Education, both of Humboldt State University, lead the final webcast in this year's series. They'll share how instructors can create asset-based, equitable learning environments in first-year writing and writing-intensive classrooms by drawing upon students' backgrounds, experiences, and prior knowledges. To do this, they and their colleagues at Humboldt have integrated two frameworks, culturally sustaining pedagogies and teaching for writing knowledge transfer. All webcasts in this series are recorded. We'll share the link at the end of this webcast. With that, let me thank Lisa and Libby for joining us and let them begin.
Thanks, Emily. I'll start us off today. We're happy to be with you. We're going to start by looking at the overview for the session. This slide outlines what we want to get to with you all today in this webinar. And we want to frame the goals for the session today by describing for you how Libby and I came to collaborate on this webinar design. what brings us here. And as I give you a little background from how we came to this webinar design, I would like you to skim the session overview and the goals that we have for you today, and also to share any goals that you have for this session in the chat pod, or just to say hello and let us know that you're here. So Libby and I have been working together across different professional learning communities at HSU over about the past year, and our most recent professional learning community work has involved working with an interdisciplinary group to develop first-year learning goals and a first-year learning community that integrates students' experiences through the curriculum and centers what it means to educate students in a Hispanic-serving institution. And in this group, we've done a lot of reading and talking together. We've read texts like Gina Garcia's Decolonizing Hispanic-Serving Institutions. We've read from Asao Inouye's writing assessment, anti-racist writing assessment ecologies, which Angela Clark-Oakes talked about in her webinar in March. And we have read a chapter from Aleem and Paris's text, Culturally Sustaining Pedagogies, which we'll talk with you about today as we think about writing transfer. So Libby and I noticed in this professional learning community that there were exciting opportunities to make connections between inclusive approaches to teaching, anti-oppressive approaches to teaching, and asset-based frameworks for thinking about the classroom, and the pedagogies that support writing. And we'll discuss how we're connecting it to writing transfer today in this webinar. We'd love your feedback on the ideas that we're bringing forward here and how we might continue to dig into the connections that we're going to be making. And because we think that these connections are essential not only for writing program instructors and writing programs themselves, but also for anyone who teaches writing. So here are our goals today on the slide. We're going to define terms. We're going to define culturally sustaining pedagogies. We're going to define knowledge transfer and writing transfer. We will be framing the theories of culturally sustaining pedagogies and writing transfer theory through a couple of anchor texts. And we'll be making connections between culturally sustaining pedagogies and writing transfer framework to look at the synergy there. And then we'll talk about what that might look like in the classroom, and we'll be asking you also to talk about what that looks like in the classroom, but also across the program and even within yourself, and do some reflection together. So are there any goals that we have today? Hi, Tara. She's thinking about the webinar working with grad students this summer. Marissa from San Francisco, first webinar she's attended. Excited to have you here. Thank you all for joining us today. Hi, Nelson. We'll talk more about asset-based instruction. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Libby.
So I hope you can hear me okay. But let's get started with our first poll. So Lisa and I would like to gauge your prior knowledge and understanding of culturally sustaining pedagogies. And I want to note that the culturally sustaining pedagogies is not the same as culturally relevant pedagogy, and we'll talk about some of the differences later in this webinar. So you can choose from the following options based on your experience with culturally sustaining pedagogies. And please note that you can choose multiple options here. So choose the best options that fit your situation. First, I use culturally sustaining pedagogies in my curriculum design. I have discussed culturally sustaining pedagogies with my composition colleagues. Next, I discuss culturally sustaining pedagogies with my first year experienced students. I have heard of or used culturally responsive pedagogy, but not culturally sustaining pedagogies. I have heard of culturally sustaining pedagogies, but I'm not exactly sure what they are. Or last, I've never heard of culturally sustaining pedagogies. So it looks like we have a variety of experiences. We have someone who's heard of culturally responsive pedagogy, but not culturally sustaining pedagogies. This is very typical right now. Culturally sustaining pedagogies is new to our dialogue and our conversation in education within the last few years. A few of you are using culturally sustaining pedagogies in your curriculum design. That's really exciting. And then we have this idea of I've heard of culturally sustaining pedagogies, but I'm not exactly sure what they are or how they work in with my current practice. So we'll move forward and I'll turn it to Lisa where we can gauge your prior knowledge about writing transfer.
Thanks, Libby. So for writing transfer, we anticipate that many of you have talked about or thought about writing transfer. And even if you haven't done that explicitly, you've engaged in it in some way in your programmatic work. There's a lot of curriculum. Look at all those 100s. There is a lot of curriculum on scholarship developed from theories of writing transfer. But I think it's useful for us to review some of the frameworks for writing transfer today, and we're going to look at Anne Beaufort's framework together. So we're seeing here in your poll results that you're using the frameworks, you're discussing the frameworks with your students and with your composition colleagues. We have at least a couple of participants that have heard of writing transfer theory, but aren't exactly sure what it is. So we'll unpack some of that for you today. And even as a writing transfer scholar myself, I find it always useful to kind of return to the baseline and foundational ideas behind what we mean when we talk about theories of transfer. And I also want to pause for a meta moment here and point out that even checking for prior experiences and prior understanding is part of how we think about teaching for transfer. It's about thinking about what we already know and how that works in the existing context where we're asked to apply our knowledge in some way. And as we move forward, we'll share specific definitions that hopefully expand on your prior knowledge or fill knowledge gaps for you about writing transfer and culturally sustaining pedagogies. Our aim here today is to frame how these two pedagogical orientations can be integrated into your programmatic or classroom practices.
So let's take a minute to dive into our first framework, which is culturally sustaining pedagogies. And I'd like to note that we are deliberately using the plural of the term pedagogies instead of pedagogy, because we're talking about multiple pedagogies that come together to be culturally sustaining, not a single pedagogy. Throughout the literature, though, as you see in the Pizzio citation right below, you will see the singular use of the term. So you'll see it used both ways throughout the text. So culturally sustaining pedagogies, or CSP, is a term that was coined originally by Django Paris in 2012, and then was further explored in his work with Sami Alim through their dialogue and reflection about their experience as educators, but also their experience as students in the educational system. Kelly Pizzio and her colleagues define CSP as teaching that helps culturally and linguistically diverse students develop and maintain cultural competency, academic success, and critical consciousness. The term maintain is really important in this definition, as well as the concept of critical consciousness, which Paulo Freire defines as the ability or agency to intervene in reality in order to change it. From Sami and Alim's work, culturally sustaining pedagogy is pedagogy that, quote, seeks to perpetuate or foster, to sustain linguistic, literature, and cultural pluralism as part of schooling for positive social transformation. And I want to take a minute to unpack some of these highlighted words. To sustain, which is to strengthen, to support, to make robust, similar to Pizzio's use of the word maintain. Pluralism, referring to different ways of existing in the world and thriving, specifically through language, literature, and culture. And then finally, for the purpose of positive social transformation, which is linked to the idea of critical consciousness, with the overarching goal of culturally sustaining pedagogy being to transform society, to decenter the dominant discourse, to create a place where different cultures live in a more pluralistic way. So culturally sustaining pedagogy is different, as I mentioned before, than culturally relevant pedagogy. While culturally sustaining pedagogy came out of a loving critique of Gloria Ladson-Billings' work around culturally relevant pedagogy and other asset-oriented approaches to education, such as Moll and Gonzalez's work around funds of knowledge. Culturally relevant pedagogy recognizes a learner's background and culture as a strength to be used to build meaningful educational practices. In Moll and Gonzalez's work around funds of knowledge, students' experiences outside of school are valued and then leveraged for learning in the classroom. Paris and Aleem emphasize that culturally sustaining pedagogies is a loving critique and that asset-oriented pedagogies lay the framework or the foundation for culturally sustaining practices. The critique comes out of the idea that asset-oriented pedagogies fall short of making sustained social change because they neglect to focus on this aspect of developing critical consciousness and decentering a white dominant discourse that is pervasive throughout our educational systems. Gloria Ladson-Billings, who is the creator of culturally relevant pedagogy, wrote in a 2014 article in the Harvard Educational Review that culturally sustaining pedagogy uses culturally relevant pedagogy as the place where the beat drops. It does not imply that the original was deficient, but rather speaks to the changing and evolving needs of a dynamic system. So Ladson-Billings suggests that her work is a valuable place to start, but in order to make sustained social change, we have to continually move forward from being culturally relevant into the realm of being culturally sustaining. So I'd like to share this image with you. And in the chat box, I'd like you to take a moment to look at the image, make some observations, and note in the chat pod what you see, what you note. What's going on in this picture? So Tara sees a spiral staircase to nowhere. Thank you, Tara. You're right. It's not going anywhere particular. There's continuity here. It's continual. I see a path that spirals up and down, so multiple directions that a person could go. Excellent. So we see a staircase in the middle of the picture that looks sort of like a spiral, almost like a double helix. Stairs are both going up and down. There's a small platform at the bottom, but there's not a platform at the top. The staircase is in the middle of a brick courtyard. Take a look at what you see around the staircase and how that might contrast to the staircase. The buildings around the staircase are multiple stories. They're very straight up and down. They have balconies, and the balconies all provide the option to see the same view, the same perspective. We've got a participant, it says iPad 1. It passes the point that may have been passed previously, but at a distance and a different level. Thank you. So bringing something new into the picture, a new option. I like this staircase, and I like thinking about this image in its relationship to culturally sustaining pedagogies, because it gives us a different way of thinking about staircases, about the purpose, about the goals, about their structure. The goal of this staircase in the center is not simply to go up and down. It could be, but there are multiple directions and places that a person could go. There's also plurality in viewpoints. A person could take a step to the left or a step to the right and shift the way of seeing or being. The staircase in the middle complicates our understanding about the structure and the purpose of stairs. This is in contrast to the surrounding buildings and the straightness of the buildings that we see in this picture. We can imagine what the staircases look like in the other buildings. While there might be a little variation in structure and material, they're all pretty much the same. The goal is to go up or down, one direction or the other. There's not many options. It's linear. We can also look at the balconies and think about the views that are offered from the balconies. A single view of a courtyard, a single perspective. We can use the staircase in the middle as a metaphor to help us think about sustained change that culturally sustaining pedagogies are moving towards, where the goal of culturally sustaining pedagogies is to de-center the dominant discourse, to de-center our thinking about education, the purpose, the goals, the way to be successful in education, and to invite different ways of being into our classrooms. Now we'll come back to culturally sustaining pedagogies and the frameworks and what this means for first year composition students. But we're going to shift for a moment to Lisa, who's going to talk a little bit about knowledge transfer and writing transfer.
Thank you, Libby. So in the same way that staircases in our traditional conceptualization of them go up and down, transfer itself originally was theorized as a purely cognitive practice that was very linear in its movement, where knowledge moved across contexts or tasks. However, as transfer researchers, which are primarily from the fields of educational psychology and cognitive educational psychology, as transfer researchers continue to look at transfer, they noticed that there was much more contextual impact on what was happening in the moment where transfer did or did not occur. So more current research on transfer has more deeply theorized it as not simply the practice of applying one's prior knowledge to a new task or to a new situation, but instead as a transformation of knowledge that is situated by specific circumstances and always within broader ecologies. So knowledge transfer then currently is described as how and whether knowledge moves across contexts for learners and with learners, and how knowledge is transformed and under what circumstances. But it is also knowledge propagation, right? No matter what our backgrounds are, as we continue to be exposed to new knowledge, we propagate that knowledge, particularly over time. Writing transfer then, in thinking about this ecological framework, has led researchers to look at it in sort of a broad contextual way. And writing transfer researchers have even problematized this word of transfer itself. Many researchers have looked at it in different ways, calling transfer a limited term that can be reconceptualized as creative repurposing, as Elizabeth Wardle has argued, as lamination, as Pryor and Shipka have presented, or as assemblage or collage, as Yancey and others have theorized. So writing transfer has been looked at these ways, that when writing knowledge is taken up from a prior situation or prior understanding and transformed into a new task or a new setting, that it can be looked at through individual actions, through what's going on in the setting or what's happening in the task, or a combination of these three things. And in this way, writing transfer is always situated and contextual. It is neither vertical nor linear, and it is always wrapped up in learners' beliefs, dispositions, and identities. And in thinking about transfer in this more broadly ecological way, we're able to see more clearly that as our understandings move forward and away from concepts, that is necessitated or situated in context and in situations. So we can think of transfer a bit more like, as Heidi Estrom would say, as scrambling up a mountainside, where sometimes we're moving to the side or even moving backwards, looking for handholds, pulling ourselves up by our feet. Writing transfer is much more nonlinear and moving actually a bit more like the staircase that we looked at in the previous slide. This next slide shows us what, oh, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. So when in teaching for knowledge transfer, the research has found so far, and this is a very abbreviated description, is that if we're trying to get students to understand particular concepts about writing, that transferring that knowledge outside of the context in which we're teaching them, it tends to be most supported through explicit teaching of those concepts and helping them grapple with those concepts in our classroom context so that they are more able to transfer them into subsequent contexts. And so explicit teaching would be around particular terms or thresholds like genre or the rhetorical situation. But it's also facilitated through metacognition and reflection. So having students constantly think about what they know and how they know it, thinking about what they'll take forward, or even horizontally into situations that they're existing in concurrent to the university, like their workplaces or their family situations. And it's also facilitated by drawing upon learners' existing knowledges and applying those knowledges to target concepts like genre or rhetorical situation. This last bullet point is really where CASP comes into play. In thinking about what types of existing knowledges learners are bringing into our classrooms and can be drawn upon in those spaces, we're really getting into a culturally sustaining framework. So this slide shows us some of the broadly used and discussed texts. These texts probably look really familiar to you. Also in the back left corner is a slide that represents the Elon research seminar on transfer that was really powerful and actually gave rise to at least two of the texts on this slide. These have emerged from or supported writing transfer research and facilitated writing transfer pedagogies. And these texts and conferences and seminars have been critical to the field in helping us think about writing as its own discipline with its own conceptual knowledge and how these concepts are learned and applied by our students in our programs and courses and outside of them. But what these sites of knowledge don't yet explicitly do is integrate a model for prior knowledge or prior knowledges as part of transfer that can foster a critical consciousness and critique of the very discourses that they make so visible, mainly academic discourses and dominant discourses that can be limiting in their representations of a plurality of voices and points of access. So here's a proof of concept slide in terms of points of access, right? We all entered this webinar today with prior knowledge. When you joined this webinar, you had prior knowledge about how writing knowledge developed. If I pose a question to you to talk about how you think writing knowledge develops across the lifespan, we would get a range of responses from each participant in the webinar. And that prior knowledge that you bring into the webinar about writing is constructed and inseparable from what you believe about it and beliefs outside of writing that inform it, your values, the identities you bring to the space, the communities of practice in which you participate, and your cultural knowledges. Think for a bit about where these come from for you. They come from your own schooling, from your reading, from discussions, your social groups, your particular interests, and the lenses that you put on to your knowledge and your teaching. These might be political or economic or gendered or all of these. So understanding our values and practices is inextricably linked to our navigation of our own professional growth, for example, including the choices we make as curriculum designers. In the same way that your knowledge about writing is situated in the broader ecology of your life, our students too come to our programs and classroom with knowledges about what literacy and writing looks like for them, and that fits into varying degrees with what the academic context asks them and demands of them. Libby's going to help us begin to look at how culturally sustaining pedagogies can help us to not only support students to draw upon and value the knowledges that they bring into the classroom space, but also how they can use these knowledges to actually enact a critical consciousness of the discourses that might be the most oppressive to their experiences.
Thank you, Lisa. So let's dive into the theoretical foundations of culturally sustaining pedagogies, including the purposes and goals of culturally sustaining pedagogies and its relationship to the work around equity and access, and how this relates to teaching writing. So culturally sustaining pedagogies is built on the belief and on the understanding that the dominant discourse of education in the United States is one that promotes assimilation and white privilege. Culturally sustaining pedagogies under its purpose, the purpose of schooling changes and it shifts in order to decenter the dominant white discourse while not just promoting but sustaining diverse community values and beliefs. Aleem and Paris write that culturally sustaining pedagogies exist wherever education sustains the lifeways of communities who have been and continue to be damaged and erased through schooling. So for instructors such as Lisa and myself, culturally sustaining pedagogy requires us as white instructors to first acknowledge and accept our own positionality in the classrooms and the ways in which we're part of the system and the overarching purpose that the system is perpetuating. It requires that we continually examine our beliefs and instructional and pedagogical practices through a lens of promoting cultural pluralism throughout our courses and throughout our educational spaces. And now in the university, we often talk about issues related to equity and access. Now, culturally sustaining pedagogy recognizes the work around equity and access as being valuable, but it also shifts that work a little bit. So it changes the goal and changes the language that we're using. Instead of focusing on equity and access, culturally sustaining pedagogy's primary goal is to decenter whiteness. It doesn't neglect equity and access, but it does refocus it. And it changes this because of the understanding that equity and access are often white-centered. So equity and access are often about how can we get these working class kids of color to be more like those middle class white kids. In writing curriculum, this looks like how can we get these working class kids of color to write more like those white kids? Culturally sustaining pedagogies changes this conversation to ask the question of how can we amplify the voices of these working class kids of color while also inviting them to critically interrogate the system. And for the purpose of this webinar, to critically interrogate the system through their writing. So this leads us directly into looking at writing transfer as a tool for amplifying voices and developing a critical consciousness. In order to understand culturally sustaining pedagogies as a tool for writing, we turn to Anne Beaufort's domains of writing knowledge transfer.
We've discussed how writing transfer is neither vertical nor linear, and that it's always situated and contextual. But we also know that when we teach for transfer, that we situate that teaching and oftentimes writing in dominant academic discourses and structures. We argue here that we have the opportunity to critique and transform these structures with our students while also asking them to engage in them. We're going to take a look at how that can be conceptualized through Anne Beaufort's 2007 Framework for Writing Knowledge Transfer out of her book. Now I'm blanking on its name, but it's around here somewhere, and it's on our last slide. In Anne Beaufort's extended case study of Tim, who was a double major in history and engineering, she followed him and interviewed him and his instructors all through his undergraduate experience to look at the writing that he was engaging in across these two majors. And then she also followed him into his first 2 years post-college as he took up some professional work in engineering. She found that as Tim moved across these different contexts for writing, where he was asked to take up new writing tasks and draw upon his prior knowledge, that he and so in those ways he's navigating sort of what expertise looked like in these different spaces, that he drew upon these 5 knowledge domains to navigate that expertise. And I'm starting here with the smaller circles in the middle, which are genre knowledge, rhetorical knowledge, subject matter knowledge, so having knowledge of the space or the community, and writing process knowledge, and that all of these are situated within a sort of an all-encompassing domain of discourse community knowledge. So for Tim, he had to start to pay attention to the different genres, rhetorical situations, subject matters across these different contexts as he navigated writing and writing expertise in them. Schooling tends to position academic discourse, which we know is not the same across disciplines, but is situated in sort of standard academic English as a dominant discourse, what G would say a discourse associated with economic and social capital. We're not saying here that academic discourse should not be taught, but that it should be taught perhaps through the lens of something like Beaufort's model, which is saying that which decenters and identifies it just as one type of discourse. And like all discourses, it has particular types of knowledges, genre, subject matters, rhetorical knowledges, processes associated with it, and that these all tend to enact a community's values and beliefs. So when we think about Beaufort's model working through the framework of culturally sustaining pedagogies, we think it would look a bit more like the staircase. Non-traditional, reimagined, non-linear. So the first thing you can imagine is that your first-year composition classroom is a discourse community. And in that discourse community, there are students bringing in various different cultural knowledge, social group knowledges, etc. Their major is also discourse community. But also our students are members across multiple discourse communities, social groups, cultural affiliations, gender orientations, and their families are also communities in these ways. And these all include, as Asao Inoue would say, languaging that looks different in each of them. They come with their own literacies, their own genres, rhetorics, processes, and subject matters. And as we've said, these each embody values and beliefs. If we imagine our classrooms or programs as a discourse community that looks something like this staircase, we're more able to see that members of the community are at different points on it. They're taking in and pointing to different viewpoints. And we offer up the idea today that by decentering the dominant discourse, by reimagining what a staircase or an architecture is, what discourses are and how we move across them, we're fostering writing transfer knowledge in culturally sustaining ways. By looking at writing transfer through the viewpoint of culturally sustaining pedagogies, we can see how writing transfer might be facilitated when knowledges of contexts and communities outside of academic space are integrated into new learning. And we can see that writing transfer is supported when writers can see or feel their membership and belonging in the communities where they are learning, because that community is seeing and feeling their membership in communities in which they already belong. But it also pushes us to think about how students can use these knowledges that they have already to critique, to transform, and engage in a critical consciousness of the academic communities that they are joining. So that begs the question, what does this look like in practice? I'm going to turn it over to
Thank you, Lisa. I think one of the most challenging aspects of this work and work of any kind related to social justice initiatives is that we can't provide a blueprint or a how-to. Anytime you're doing social justice work, it must come from the community in which you're working, and it must be tied directly to the needs of the community and based on the values and voices and experience of community members. In learning spaces such as ours, this community includes students, families, and instructors. So we can't give you a hierarchical approach or a blueprint. Because the minute an external authority comes in and says, this is what you need to do, this is how you create a culturally sustaining learning space, then it's not culturally sustaining at all. It takes away that the power of the voices of the community member. So what does that mean for us as educators? It means that we can dialogue and we can share examples of what this might look like in our learning spaces. We can share what we've tried. We can share things that we're attempting. And we have to focus on this through a lens of transferability. So I'm going to try something in my learning space, and I'll give you the details and you can see what happens in your learning space, instead of the goal of generalizability, where we're looking for something, a generalizable approach. So we have a question for you to think about, and I invite you to share your ideas in the chat pod as Lisa and I share some of the ideas that we have been working with over the last few semesters. So our question is, what might culturally sustaining pedagogies look like in a classroom, program, or individual practice as an approach to facilitating writing knowledge transfer? So I welcome you to share your ideas as we talk through some of our work. So in our work, we have some of the things that we have tried out in our practice and dialogued about. First is to create text, so instructor created text, such as syllabi and assignments that affirm students' knowledges, not only academic, but including knowledges about family, social groups, cultural affiliations, genders, and to show how these knowledges integrate with content and conceptual knowledges about writing. For us, this means looking at the languages that we're using in our syllabi and how we address the students in our text. Is the language that we're using culturally sustaining and accessible for all members of our community? Explicitly building on what students already know and being clear about what we want them to achieve, including critical consciousness of learning and transferring knowledge into and out of and about dominant structures and discourses. Evaluating text, authors, and viewpoints that are represented in our courses and our programs, and develop a true representation of these text, authors, and viewpoints, including counter viewpoints that are in conversation about critical concepts such as translingualism, thank you, multiliteracies, code meshing, switching, textual production, and discourse. And the last is fairly simple, but it's been incredibly impactful in my practice. This is to develop classroom norms, assignment expectations, program expectations in collaboration with students, while allowing students to develop these for the instructor as well. I see a few coming in the chat box. Tara, thank you. Building on students' interest, expertise, and experiences. Excellent, bringing these into the conversation. Emily has a question. Would community participate in constructing the syllabus and generating text? Emily, absolutely. I think that's that really shifts the way we often think about creating classes in higher education. And when you try something like this, I invite you to try something like this with students and watch their responses and their reactions. It's pretty exciting. And Lisa has a few more ideas for application that we've been working with.
The second slide of applications, same question that we posed to you. You can keep chiming in the chat box with ideas that you have about what CSP might look like in a classroom program or individual practice. And we do talk a little bit about individual practice in this slide. One application that we're sharing with you today is engaging students in tasks that ask them to maintain a critical consciousness. For this one, we can circle back to something like Beaufort's framework. If we have students looking at discourses through their own sort of interests or affiliations, one of the things that they can do is look at how genre works in those spaces. What's the rhetorical knowledge? What's the subject matter? And then how are those actually enacted values and beliefs of those communities, and who's represented by those beliefs, who participates in those communities, and that allows them to have like that critical consciousness and and think about transforming those discourses through their own participation in them. Read texts that examine and discuss privilege, power, and cultural transformation. I've been playing around with making sure that texts are in conversation with each other, not only looking at one viewpoint, but putting texts that maybe have opposing or counter viewpoints to each other to help us unpack some ideas around privilege, power, and cultural transformation. And the last two, maintain our own critical perspectives and share with your colleagues and broader communities. This is a way to get culturally sustaining approaches to pedagogy deeply meaningful into our own practices by talking through them, what's working, what's not, what's troublesome, what's challenging, but also maintaining a critical perspective of awareness of privilege, cultural humility, things that help us take a step back and think about our own orientations to this work and what values and beliefs and discourse knowledges we're bringing to the work. Tara wrote, I like to use student choice, book clubs, etc., where students can build on interest and experience by bridging it to academic writing, reading tasks. Yeah, that's really what we're getting at today with thinking about acknowledging, not just acknowledging or responding to their knowledges, but taking that even one step forward to use those knowledges as a framework for even critique of the dominant knowledges that we're asking them to engage in. So now we are on our reflection slide. We have 3 questions posed for you today. What's a takeaway that you have from this discussion today, something that you're thinking about? The second question is similar to the question we just asked. So what's something you already do or could adjust to explicitly draw upon culturally sustaining pedagogies as a support for writing knowledge transfer, and any questions that you have?
Thank you, Lisa and Libby. While people are reflecting, and I see Tara has a reflection, maybe I'll pause and let you respond to Tara's reflection first.
You can always count on Tara for being such a wonderful participant. Tara says, a takeaway, wanting to talk more explicitly with my students about CSP and how the work we do builds on a critical consciousness. Yeah, I really feel like in the same way that Beaufort argues that we should make explicit the teaching of things like genre and rhetorical knowledge, we can also make explicit, terms like a critical consciousness and bringing a critical consciousness to the work that we're doing as writers in our first year composition classrooms. And that is a critical consciousness. Unpacking that becomes then a transferable concept. Emily says, it's too easy to default to familiar structures. Yeah, and so that's, in designing this webinar, Libby, feel free to chime in here. I'll speak for myself. I even felt, some tensions in myself about how the ways that we're pushing a conversation into something like a PowerPoint presentation and thinking about those kinds of structures as well.
Many of the processes that we have outside of the classroom are also default structures that we practice because they were in place before we entered into the spaces ourselves, and those may also perpetuate our comfort with the way things that have been done. So yeah. I have one question for the two of you, while there might be a couple of more reflections coming in, which is if you would, either of you would share, give us a glimpse of one thing that you've done in your classroom in particular and what the result was like, because I could imagine it could be surprising and it could be challenging in ways that we don't anticipate.
Go ahead, Libby, go ahead.
Well, I'd like to talk, it's not in our classroom, but it's in our PLC work. So Lisa and I are currently working on a professional learning community with faculty and staff on campus to develop a new first year learning community with a developing Hispanic and serving institution grant that we're working with. And it's been really exciting work. But it's also been incredibly challenging work because we're bringing frameworks such as culturally sustaining pedagogies and work into the courses that encourage students to unpack the dominant discourse and the dominant structure of the new university which they're attending. And so Lisa and I are working with this team of educators to develop a learning experience. And much of it, it has been incredibly powerful work, but it's been challenging work. And it's been this very this process where we have to go over our ideas and look at the language we're looking and look at our goals again and again and again. Because as Emily mentioned just moments ago, we're part of the system and we're very comfortable with the way that things work. And so just highlighting that this work is challenging and it's a process, a long process, and it requires engaging in dialogue with others and continuing to unpack our own positionality and how that influences the work that we're doing and listen to the voices of our participants. So just some of the challenges and the continual work that this type of work takes.
I'd like to respond to Nelson's question, which is really, really important. Nelson asks, how do we deal with the fact that we as white faculty make the problem worse by being in front of the classroom? I mean, I don't know about, I don't think I have an answer about the extent to which or even whether we make it worse. But I think that it's important that we acknowledge our positionality as white faculty when we're in front of the classroom, and to say that that positionality comes with limitations, and that you are, I think it's important to be really transparent about ways that you're confronting that positionality and those limitations and looking to even disrupt them and engage students in sort of disrupting and even transforming those the structures that white faculty have been so comfortable in. And so this isn't really about writing transfer, but I will say that I've been experimenting with contract grading via Asao Inui's work, and having students just have a sense of that the grade is theirs. They have decided and agreed to the work that they will do, the labor that they will put into the work for the grade that they've agreed to, makes it so that my interactions with my students becomes more like I am simply coaching them to be their best selves within that context and that content. And we talk a lot about what types of feedback they most prefer. So really helping them come to the situation and speak from the things that work for them, which is really coming from their knowledges and their knowledge base. I think helps to bring in a more culturally sustaining approach. And then if we have a second, I'll just say that this is not really my work. This is work that has been developed within the program that I direct by the really amazing lecturers here. All these different ways to think about discourse community work, including, students who look at different social groups or family groups or cultural groups that they belong to, and really looking at how texts work in those spaces, including texts like dances, texts like songs, texts like oral tradition, and really seeing that those concepts of writing, like genre, work in all of these spaces, and that those become important cultural critical knowledges that they can bring into the dominant discoursal space.
Thanks, you, Lisa and Libby. We've had a small audience today, but an engaged audience. So I want to thank them for joining us and for you for presenting the way that you've put these two frameworks together to create more equitable learning conditions for the students you teach, and for bringing the instructors that you work with into these discussions in an interactive way. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webcast, all of these webcasts are recorded. The recordings are usually available within 24 to 48 hours. You can find them at our professional development calendar at calstate.edu, which you can get to by typing in that URL that you see on the slide there, but also by putting professional development calendar into the search box. It should take you there, and look for the red archive button where the listings move once the date has passed and the recording and slides are attached there. And as I mentioned, this is the finale of the 8 webcasts that we've produced this year. I want to thank Tara Lockhart, who was with us earlier, for putting this series together. Worked really hard on that last summer. So I would like to continue this next year. So this is an invitation to people who are with us today or who might tune in later. If you'd like to lead a webcast, if you have a colleague that you know who should lead a webcast, then contact us. My email address is listed there. We have one more event to conclude what has been a tremendous year for the CSU, thanks to the efforts of faculty who've stretched themselves in order to deepen students' abilities to use writing as a tool for learning. We're hosting the final professional development event of this year on Wednesday, June 19th at a hotel near LAX. So if you're part of your campus team, we look forward to seeing you there to celebrate this year's achievements and to set new goals for student success in our second year of implementing these new policies. And to close, I want to thank you all for all you're doing to engage students at the college level as they launch their pursuit of academic, personal, and professional goals in the CSU. Have a wonderful rest of your Friday, a wonderful conclusion to your term. Celebrate with the students who are graduating and moving on to the next phase of their lives this year. And we look forward to seeing you online again next year.